Good afternoon. Please remain standing during the playing of the Canadian and the Ukrainian national anthem as sung by the Vitor Ukrainian Folk Choir. I ask in the observations of the COVID-19 public health guidelines outlined by Dr. Dina Henshaw that you please refrain from joining and singing aloud. Thank you. Please be seated. MLA Armstrong-Hominick, MLA Billis, Mr. Danileko, Ms. Boychuk, Holodomor survivors and their descendants, MLAs, Clerk Dean, and honored guests, most of you joining us online. My name is Nathan Cooper, and I'm the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, and it is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you here today and thank you for joining us here in the Rotunda to pay your respects to this extremely important event and do so in a safe manner Sometimes challenges in our lives breed innovation, and I think that's what we saw today with the choir joining us. It was a great pleasure to have them. While we're not able to gather as we would prefer, this event allows us to honor the millions of lives that were lost during the Ukraine famine and genocide. We recognize the survivors and their unquenchable spirit. Holodomor was a horrific, man-made famine in Soviet Ukraine, and it is remembered as one of the darkest periods in human history. In commemorating the Holodomor, we join with the people of Ukraine and the Ukrainians all around the world by honoring the victims of this terrible tragedy and remembering their suffering and giving a voice to their stories. Holodomor is a Ukrainian word that means extermination by starvation, and it is used to describe the Ukraine famine and genocide of 1932-33. During this time, Ukrainian people were forced to deliver their marketable grain to the state with severe consequences for failing to do so. By 1932, violating the sanctity of the socialist property, which grain was considered, was punishable by death. Under the sponsorship of former Speaker, the late Jean Swazdeski, the Legislative Assembly of Alberta passed a bill in 2008 declaring the fourth Saturday in November the Ukrainian Famine and Genocide Holodomor Memorial Day. This day recognizes the millions of Ukrainian women, men, and children who perished during this horrific man-made famine of 1932-33. Today's event is an opportunity to recognize the struggle and the strength of the victims, but to acknowledge survivors and honor their unwavering spirit. The Holodomor remains one of the largest mass exterminations of civilians in history. Yet the Soviet government spent decades trying to cover up the scope of these atrocities, and for generations of the inhumane acts went largely unknown and unrecognized by those living outside of the Ukraine. It is important, through events like today, that we continue to expand the world's knowledge of this horrific tragedy. Poet and philosopher George Santayana said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." It is incumbent upon us to ensure the horrors of this tragedy are recognized today and remembered for generations to come. We must remember the worst of our history in order to ensure that these atrocities never, ever are repeated. Slava Ukraine, Slava Alberta. I would now like to invite Ms. Jackie Armstrong Hominick, the MLA for Fort Saskatchewan-Vegreville, to bring greetings on behalf of the Honourable Premier Jason Kenney.
Thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you, Vitor Ukrainian Folk Choir, for those wonderful renditions of the Canadian and Ukrainian national anthems. And thank you to Speaker Cooper, MLA Billis, and cherished guest Alexander Danilenko, Consul General of Ukraine in Edmonton, and Arissa Boychuk, President of Ukrainian Canadian Congress, Alberta Provincial Council. It is my sincere honor to welcome you here to the Alberta Legislature on this important day. And as you heard, my name is Jackie Armstrong Hominick, and I'm the MLA for Fort Saskatchewan-Vegreville. And I'm proud to be the chair of ACWAR, the Advisory Council on Alberta-Ukraine Relations, and also the chair of the Alberta Skilled Trades Caucus. Above all, I'm proud to be Ukrainian. My Ukrainian identity is integral to who I am as a mother, as a citizen, as a business person, and as a legislator. As some of you may know, I'm a descendant of Ivan Pilipo, the first Ukrainian immigrant to Canada. Ivan Pilipo's story was not unlike so many other Ukrainians who migrated to our free and promising lands. Ivan Pilpo came to Canada in the first of 3 large waves of Ukrainian migration between the late 1800s and the early mid-1900s. Ukrainian people have often had to travel great distances to escape hardships and to find better lives. Ukrainian people have faced many hardships over their history, none worse than the Holodomor, the communist planned famine of Ukrainians and others in 1932 and 1933. During this time, millions of men, women, and children were starved to death in a deliberate policy of the communist state of Joseph Stalin. During this time, this was a genocide and an unspeakable tragedy that we managed to find the words to describe each and every year in order to ensure the world never forgets. But as Ukrainian people, we often speak about this sad history with more than just our words. For instance, as a young girl, I remember sitting on the lap of my Baba, Anna Huli. She always wore an apron. At one time in particular, I noticed the apron was rather lumpy. And I would ask her, Baba, what's in your apron? Potatoes, she would say. And Baba would carry potatoes in her apron at all times. She said, you never know when you may need them. I remember this about my Baba fondly, but I look back on this now and I reflect on the great sadness behind it. During the Holodomor, Stalin's regime sealed off much of central and eastern Ukraine from any incoming food. All grain and agricultural products were confiscated from farmers because those farmers refused to participate in a communist collectivization of their lands. So while we Ukrainians love food, we also value and cherish food because of its dark chapter in our history. The Holodomor was a terrible evil. Here in Alberta, we recognize the Holodomor as a genocide, with the 4th Saturday in November serving as a day to remembrance for victims. As a proud Ukrainian, I'm honored to be here with you today remembering the victims of Holodomor. This is a dark chapter in human history that we have to recognize and remember so that we never have it repeated again. On behalf of Premier Kenney, the entire government of Alberta, I wish to offer my prayers to all the victims and their families. Memory eternal. May a terrible evil like this never happen again. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. I would now like to invite Mr. Darren Billis, the MLA for Edmonton Beverly Clairview, to bring greetings on behalf of the Leader's official opposition.
Slava Isusu Christu. Thank you, Speaker Cooper, for hosting this incredibly important commemoration today. I appreciate the fact that we are using virtual technology so that so many Albertans of Ukrainian descent and Albertans are able to participate in this year's service. I'd like to acknowledge, starting with Mr. Leonid Korowenik, a survivor of the Holodomor, as well to acknowledge my platform guests, Ms. Jackie Armstrong-Homeniuk, Consul General Daniel Leko, and Oresia Boychuk, President of Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, and Clerk Dean. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow colleagues, Holodomor survivors and families, I am humbled to be here today. I want to start by acknowledging that we are gathered on traditional Treaty 6 territory and Métis lands. Before I deliver remarks on behalf of Rachel Notley, Leader of Alberta's official opposition, and my caucus colleagues, I do want to acknowledge and thank the many leaders of various Ukrainian organizations in Alberta for your tireless dedication to the community and your work in ensuring that people of all backgrounds and affiliations come together for this very important remembrance of Holodomor. Today, we honor the millions of lives that were lost during the Ukrainian famine and genocide. We commemorate the survivors and their unconquerable spirit in defending their nationalistic pride amidst forced assimilation and surviving some of the most horrific conditions any humans have ever had to endure. The Holodomor was an undeniable act of genocide. It was an unforgivable crime against humanity. Without a doubt, it was intentional death by starvation. Today, descendants in the Ukrainian diaspora around the world, including here in Alberta, continue to feel traumatized by our ancestors' experiences. But from the darkness of the Holodomor came hope. We understand that the past cannot be changed and that we cannot right the wrongs that were done to our ancestors. When I traveled to the Holodomor Memorial in Kiev, Ukraine, I placed a pot of wheat on behalf of Alberta in recognition of the millions who starved. We are here as proof that hope somehow surfaced from the depths of despair of the Holodomor, and the spirit of the Ukrainian people was not broken. Generations later, that spirit is alive and thriving. It lives within the over 375,000 people of Ukrainian descent in Alberta and the millions across the world. It is with that same hope that the first of our ancestors came to Canada over 128 years ago, and with that same spirit, that fighting spirit that is synonymous with Ukrainian culture, that the following generations contributed to all the facets of society to help build this great province. To imagine an Alberta void of these virtues would be simply impossible. Vічна пам'ять, vічna pamyat, vічna pamyat. Slava Ukraini, Slava Alberta.
Thank you, MLA Billis, for your remarks on behalf of the Leader of Her Majesty's Official Opposition, Rachel Notley. I would now like to invite the Consul General of Ukraine in Edmonton, Mr. Danilenko, for his remarks.
Honorable Speaker Nathan Cooper, members of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, дорога українська громада, ladies and gentlemen, these days are incredibly sad days for us, for all Ukrainians around the globe. These days, with a deep sorrow in our hearts, we commemorate millions of innocent victims of Holodomor, one of the most terrible crimes in the history of humankind, deliberately planned and executed in Ukraine by the communist regime of Joseph Stalin. Just in 1 year, from 4 to 6 million of Ukrainians, innocent men, women, children, died from artificial starvation. Just imagine, it's practically the more than entire population of Alberta. 1 year and hundreds of flourishing Ukrainian villages with peaceful peasants turned into ghosts, with human corpses lying everywhere because there was no one left who could bury them. Ukrainians were doomed to the slow, agonizing death just because they wanted to be free on their own land, peacefully grow crops and their children. They just wanted to speak their native language, remember their own history, and honor their heroes. They simply wanted to be Ukrainians. But Soviet regime could not allow it. In their eyes, it was a deadly crime to be free, immediate threat to the Stalin communist system. Soviets wanted that everyone on the territory of the Soviet Union to be an impersonal Soviet citizen, blindly loyal to the regime, citizen who has forgotten his own history and language and doesn't ask any question. But that was not the case with Ukrainians. Ukrainians have always been a threat to the communist regime. We have always been fighting for our freedom and dignity. Right after the October upheaval, in 1918, Ukraine proclaimed its independence. Ukrainian farmers refused to join collective farms. They just wanted to remain owners of their own land. When Soviets understood that Ukrainians would never give up, they decided to punish them to death. This decision led to suffering, pain, grief, and death in Ukraine on a horrific scale. We probably will never know the real number of victims, because the regime diligently concealed all evidence of the crime and prevented the dissemination of the information about it. But sooner or later, the truth always comes out. And that truth about Holodomor horrified the world. Reacting to the revealed information, many countries and separate jurisdictions recognized Holodomor as an act of genocide. And of course, Canada and Alberta among them. On behalf of Ukrainian people, I would like to extend our words of gratitude to the Canadian federal government and parliament, as well as to the government and legislative assembly of Alberta for recognizing Holodomor as an act of genocide of Ukrainian people. We highly appreciate your understanding and continuous support. And I'm talking now not only about the Holodomor recognition. Since the very first day of our independence, we have always been feeling the strong and reliable support of our trusty friend, especially in difficult moments of our history. I also would like to say words of gratitude to the Ukrainian community. You have made many tremendous work to make Canadian society aware of Holodomor, to make this recognition happen. You gathered tons of evidence. You made many historical researches to disclose the truth about Holodomor. You spoke loudly about it when we in Ukraine, in Soviet Ukraine at that time, were prohibited to even think about it, under the threat of arrest and imprisonment. Thanks to your efforts, the very first ever monument to the Holodomor victims was erected here in Edmonton in 1983 to bring the world's attention to this tragedy. This crime must not be forgotten. It's very important to teach the future generation this hard lesson about the dark pages of our history, for them to know, to understand, and when they grow up, to stand on guard for the freedom, for the dignity, and for the humanity. In this regard, I am grateful to the government of Alberta, Alberta Education, for including Holodomor topic in the school program. Honorable Speaker, MLAs, all our Canadian friends, thank you very much for being with us today, commemorating the victims of Holodomor, and for sharing this deep sorrow with us. We should never forget it. We should never let it happen again. Вічна пам'ять.
Thank you, Mr. Danilenko. I would now like to invite Rysia Boychuk, the President of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, Alberta Provincial Council, to bring remarks on behalf of the Council.
Holodomor survivors, Honorable Nathan Cooper, Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, members of the Legislative Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, and dear children. On behalf of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, Alberta Provincial Council, and the Ukrainian-Canadian community here in Alberta, I'm honored to be here today to both commemorate those who lost their lives in this senseless genocide in Ukraine's history, and to express to the government of Alberta our gratitude for developing, accepting, and recognizing annually, even during a pandemic, the Ukrainian Famine Genocide Holodomor Memorial Day Act. Home of over 365,000 individuals of Ukrainian heritage, Alberta has been a leader in helping our community let the world know that we have not and will not forget the single greatest catastrophe endured by Ukraine during Soviet rule, the Holodomor. This was not just a general tragedy in the area. This was part of Stalin's campaign against Ukrainian nationalism. This was murder by starvation. In 1953, Raphael Lemkin, known as the father of United Nations Convention on Genocide, described the 1932-33 famine in Soviet Ukraine as the classic example of Soviet genocide. He went on to state that if Soviet program succeeds completely, if the intelligentsia, the priests, and the peasants can be eliminated, Ukraine will be dead, as if every Ukrainian were killed. For it will have lost that part which kept and developed its culture, its beliefs, its common ideas, which have guided it and given it a soul. In short, and made it a nation. This is not simply a case of mass murder, it is a case of genocide, of destruction, not of individuals only, but of a culture and a nation. However, Ukraine's culture, its beliefs, its common ideas have guided it and given it a soul that endured. At the height of Holodomor, Ukrainians were dying at a rate of 25,000 per day, 1,000 per hour, 17 per minute. The importance of commemorations such as today is that now they carry even greater significance. As Russia continues to deny this genocide and suggests that Holodomor was just the result of difficult circumstances, events like today will serve as reminders that the world, that Canadians, and that Albertans know differently. Historical realities which are well documented and events like today help to educate in order to ensure that such genocides are no longer a part of our history on any continent. The first Ukrainians to draw attention to the tragedy of the Holodomor were survivors who fled to the West. They were initially dismissed by much of the Western political and intellectual establishments. Nonetheless, they continued their efforts in decades that followed. And to all of them, to those who have now passed, and to those who are still with us, Pani Natalia Talenchuk and Pan Leo Korovnik, we, our community, and our society owes you a great debt of gratitude for your persistence and ability to continue reliving a time in your life I am certain you would sooner forget. Ukraine remembers, the world acknowledges, Vічная пам'ять, слава Україні.
Thank you, Ms. Boychuk. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now ask that you turn your attention to the screen for a special reading of an original poem by survivor Mr. Leo Koronik entitled Hell Like Holodomor.
Hell like Holodomor. On this historic, somber day, we come a message to convey how Russia tried to dominate our country and the people's fate. My 90th year goes by, still Stalin chooses to deny it through pride and simply blatant lie. It was the root of genocide. Now let us trace how this began, all done by Russia's evil clan. In 1928, the harvest in Ukraine was great. In 31, it was the same. Again we reached our yearly aim. The wheat was ripe on golden fields, a sign of bountiful yields. Sunflowers like young soldiers stood. There was a blissful, joyous mood. They sunshine with great joy embraced, and the surrounding landscape graced. The Lord gave growth and also rain, and on the roof a nestling crane. It seemed a peaceful, happy place, but fear was written on each face. The Kremlin long ago began to weave an evil, deadly plan. In 32 it stooped so low to strike Ukraine the hardest blow. It seized the cattle, poultry, grain, and shipped to Moscow all by train, with signs emblazoned on each door. Keep locked, it's paint and nothing more. They left no food, not in a crumb. Time came to fearful death succumb. In parching heat with nasty flies, the mother heard her children's cries. O mother, pray to God to send a piece of bread, for life will end. As for our niece, the week before, her soul now crossed the eternal shore. With empty stomachs and great pain, they cried for food again in vain, then whispered, Mom, don't say goodbye. Without you, we all will die. Their tender hearts were shocked by fears. Their sunken eyes were filled with tears, and then they saw this world no more. They also reached the eternal shore. The world must know, and we should say, the Kremlin took our food away, and millions of our people died. But Russia all those facts denied. At times it seemed there was no God, for Stalin ruled and gave a nod to evil men. You act my way, that Kiev sees no light of day. And yet, since World War II went by, some countries still apologize. Though in Ukraine, 10 million die. In Russia, every eye is dry. In those insane and reckless times, our foe has caused appalling crimes and sent Ukraine through horrid hell. I lived through that and came to tell that you would know how they behaved. They threatened, tortured, and enslaved. They thought we would not rise again, but we had faith, just a small grain. Thus we have crossed the Rubicon, declared Ukraine must live on. It lives, because our women, men, have sealed their promise with Amen. Let us all stand for motherland with courage and a steady hand at this decisive, timely hour. May heaven grant us greater power. This somber moment, let us pause. Remember those who for a cause have paid the highest price, their lives. God saw their grief, tears filled his eyes.
Elementary School Choir will now perform the song Dry Tears. This song was written in 2013 on the 80th anniversary of the Holodomor. The intent was to teach students about the Holodomor by looking at the events through the eyes of children. School-aged children that were innocently living their daily lives at the time of the Holodomor. The chorus reflects the voices of children who truly have the future in their hands.
Ladies and gentlemen, St. Ignatiu Ukrainian Bilingual Children's Choir.
some changes in our ceremony this morning. We're still going to have a candle lighting, but I am going to call upon the participants to light each candle one at a time, and we'll do that individually before returning to their seats. Playing the prayer for our candle lighting remembrance will be provided by violinist Karen Dashishin. And following the lighting of the third candle, there will be a moment of silence. Please rise for the lighting of the candles and the moment of silence. Please be seated. As we conclude our commemoration, I want to extend my sincerest thank yous to each of you who have joined in our ceremony this morning. I would like to extend a special thank you to members of the Legislative Assembly, IT and broadcast teams who worked diligently to ensure that even in light of a pandemic and many reasons to postpone came together so that not even those things would get in the way of us commemorating and honoring the survivors and the victims of this horrific event. Alberta is home to somewhere close to 370,000 people of Ukrainian ancestry. Some of those who are survivors and some who are the descendants of survivors. So much of Alberta's history is strong because of the work and the efforts of the Ukrainian community. The overcoming spirit, the never give up desire to bring hope and light to others that resonates so true in the Ukrainian spirit exists in the Albertan spirit as a result of that. We honor this unconquerable strength that is reflected in the vibrant cultures and the ideas of many Ukrainian communities that have contributed to the building of our great province. And every year we mark the Holodomor, solidifies our commitment that we will never, ever, ever allow such crimes against humanity to be repeated. Thank you all so much for joining me. May God continue to bless you. May God bless Ukraine, and may God bless Alberta.